Let's take NAFTA, because I think NAFTA is one of the big agreements that most of the audience is familiar with. How did the integration of the economies of Canada, the US, and Mexico potentially lead to disintegration of internal cohesion? Like, what's a specific example of you feel that happening?
I think the effect of NAFTA, clearly there were a lot of benefits in the ability of firms to establish and deepen their value chains, and in automotive and in consumer electronics, those value chains were deepened. If you happen to be working for corporations where this happened, and you were in the right place in the management or the production chain, you were clearly benefited. But a lot of communities in the United States were actually fairly devastated by the increase in imports from Mexico once the tariffs came down, and these production chains were established. Now, interestingly, the first order effect of NAFTA is really distributional. I mean, if you went looking for the overall economic effects for U.S. national income, GDP, any aggregate measure of well-being in the United States, basically you'd have to go into the second digit after the decimal point to identify any economic effect. But if you look at what the effects were on specific communities in the Rust Belt, or in some particularly areas that were producing goods that were now competing with Mexican imports from Mexico directly, there were some very large effects, and these effects were not just in tradables in manufacturing, but you would have then these income and job losses translate into reduced demand for local services and businesses, and all kinds of social ills that went with that. And because the United States does such a terrible job of taking care of people who are adversely affected by these shocks, and given that these shocks were very severely localized, when you lost a single factory, the whole community and the town was hit very badly. So these had very adverse effects, and interestingly, it's very much a similar story in Mexico as well. I mean, I think many of the northern areas in Mexico did very well. The south, mainly agricultural, did very poorly. So you had this gaps between the gainers and the losers being really the big effect of NAFTA, and not on sort of aggregate economic performance or aggregate employment or aggregate growth.
So I want to talk to you about two aspects of the political economy of that. And the first one is distribution. So when I talk to pro-free trade economists, what you will hear is an argument that goes like this. Free trade and these trade agreements and NAFTA, et cetera, that in both models, and I think to some degree in practice, they grow economies and they create a lot more money for everybody. People are able to specialize, the economies get more efficient, everybody wins. But then you'll say, well, but look, there are going to be these communities or these people or these subgroups that lose. And they say, yeah, but with all the money that is being generated, we can more than compensate the losers. And so that's the argument that is used when you have abstract discussions about trade. And then we get into the real world where it seems to me there is no actual significant compensation of the losers. And so you have this disconnect between the model, which works as far as I can tell. I mean, if you were willing to really lean into it, and then the actual politics, which take that first step of creating the trade agreement, but don't really take that second of then saying, okay, well, we're going to have to make really, really big extra steps to make sure the distribution of this is working out. And there's something there that the economics profession, to me, has never seriously grappled with. That the failure of the model to account for how the politics actually works, it's not a complicated failure, but it doesn't seem to be one that there's ever been an answer to or an accounting for.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. The proof of the argument that you could make trade, particularly trade with low-income countries, work if you had adequate mechanisms of compensation and redistribution is Europe, because Europe has very extensive safety nets in the form of an extensive welfare state. And trade with countries like China or other low-income countries, to this day actually is not politically controversial in Europe, in large part because they have a very good system of taking care of the losers. So that we can see how their existing safety nets have insulated a lot of the losers. Now, in the United States, I think the mistake that was made here was that with every trade agreement that was signed, and NAFTA was not an exception, there was a tendency for trying to bring the potential losers and labor unions along by promising with each new agreement an expansion of what's called trade adjustment assistance, so that you promise compensation. But then, the compensation, it turns out, is never provided after the fact for the very reason you've identified, which is that, once you've signed the trade agreement, the political incentive after the fact to make the funding available to ensure that it works as advertised is simply not there. In fact, this is a problem that economists call the problem of time inconsistency or dynamic inconsistency. You have an incentive to promise compensate, but once you've achieved the policy change that you wanted, you actually don't have an incentive to follow through on it because you can't simply reverse the agreement, at least not without cost. So this was perfectly predictable, and I think it's a consequence of the fact that the welfare state and safety nets in the United States have always been weak, and the only time that really works, this promise of compensation, is when compensation or redistribution is an ingrained part of an explicit bargain, a constitutive part of the social contract, if you will, and it's not directed solely at trade, but it's part of, essentially a social contract that is much broader in the form of a strong welfare state, and that's what we have in the case of Europe.
It's always struck me that when you try to think about what would a really robust trade adjustment assistance program look like, if we were really going to fall through on that promise, how would you do it? It gets very, very difficult. The losers of trade deals, if you are in a community where the manufacturing jobs collapsed, okay, maybe it's pretty easy to trace who got fired from the plant. I mean, we could do that if we chose and give them significant compensation, again, if we chose. Sometimes we give them a little bit, but never certainly more than enough to make up for what happened. But what about the waitress who worked at the coffee shop right near it? What about the mother whose husband is now home and moping and upset? And you kind of go down the line. And one of the things that has always struck me about American policy in general is we're very bad at place-based policy. We do not have good programs that really focus on specific communities. We have a couple things to try, things like tax credits for this or that community. But in general, we don't like saying Detroit is suffering. We're going to help Detroit. We're really going to make a specific effort to help Detroit, in part because it feels unfair. Why, if you're helping Detroit, shouldn't you also help Stockton, California, or whatever it might be? But I always think that even within the theory of this, that people underestimate how hard it would be to manage the specific, to really do something that isn't just redistributing money to quote unquote the poor or the working class, but to try to make sure these specific losers of trade were compensated.
I've written recently that, we've been talking about compensation and redistribution, but let's be clear that for a whole bunch of reasons, including those that you've just mentioned, having this conversation in a future-oriented way, that the time for compensation or redistribution has come and gone. This is really a discussion about what we might have done and did not do, and there are all kinds of reasons about why compensation is not going to work for the future, and it has to do with the fact that if you just do the math, the amount of resources that you need to raise to really do a proper compensation would, exhaust the gains from trade that you're getting with these new agreements, given the form that they take. You have all kinds of other issues about which you're getting at, which is why would you want to compensate some type of losers and not others? What's special about trade and so forth? So, and I think you're right about the peculiarities of the U.S. system, which is the U.S. attachment to a certain version of localism means that in some ways there's too little fiscal centralization in the U.S. That, once property values, for example, in a particular community start going down, the whole resource base collapses with that. So your ability to do something with public resources also goes down and so forth, given the dependence on local property taxes. But let me just make 2 points with respect to redistribution or compensation, which aren't sufficiently appreciated. One is that just like in the case of the European welfare state, for much of for many trade shocks, it's not at all clear why you would want to just pick on trade. If somebody's losing their job, it shouldn't matter whether that person, as you said, is a waitress or is, a production worker in some steel factory. For the bulk of trade, it's no different than other kinds of economic shocks. So we should have safety nets or that are, whether place-based or more generically designed that take care better of people. The second issue is that some types of trade shocks are not properly handled simply by telling people, oh, never mind, we're just going to give you a handout. Because when we force American workers to compete with workers in other countries where workers' rights are grossly violated, where basic health and safety requirements in factories are not in place, we are doing something that's very different from when a worker loses their job because somebody has come up with a better product or somebody turns out to be a better competitor. We're basically telling that worker that we expect you to compete with workers under competition rules that we find unconscionable, domestically, but yet this is what you have to do. And I think that is a fundamentally different kind of competition. And I think we should have different ways of dealing with such types of competition. I've talked in my own writings about making an allowance for cases of social dumping, which is basically cases where we're forcing our workers to compete under conditions that would be completely illegal or unconscionable from a moral or ethical standpoint domestically. And I think in those cases, actually, it's perfectly appropriate to think about how we protect our workers differently than simply giving them a handout. And in some such cases, it's as plausible to protect them through trade remedies, such as blocking off that trade or putting some import tariffs, in quite the same way that we have anti-dumping duties when foreign firms are trying to undercut domestic firms because they're being subsidized or they're pricing below marginal cost for predation reasons. We can block that kind of trade because we say it's not fair trade. We have to really think about, how that same concept of fairness also applies with respect to trade that might be having adverse environmental, consumer safety, or I think what I'm really most concerned with is sort of labor standard, considerations at home.